This is a presentation on Immanuel Kant's moral philosophy, in particular discussion of what he has to say about imperatives. For Kant, the moral law has to take the form of an imperative. Now, an imperative, you might remember from your high school grammar, is a statement that's a command or an order. There are other kinds of sentences, declarative sentences or indicative sentences which say something about something. There are interrogative sentences which ask a question, expressive sentences, and so forth. But an imperative is a command, like sit down or bring me a beer. And I want to talk a little bit about the form of imperatives and different types of imperatives and see which kind of imperative in particular can represent or encapsulate the moral law. So here's a kind of a busy slide, just one slide in this presentation. I want to walk you through this. Okay, so at the top you see the word imperative, and again, that's sort of a that's a word that signifies a command or an order of some kind, and a moral law is an order. Thou shalt not kill is an imperative. It's a command not to do a particular thing. So we need to talk about that a little bit. There are two general types of imperatives according to Kant. There are hypothetical imperatives and categorical imperatives. And you can learn some more about this material in the study guides that I provided for you, and of course in the Kant's text itself. But let's look at these two types. Let's look at the right-hand side first of all, the hypothetical imperatives. A hypothetical imperative is something that's necessary or imperative for you if you want to do something. Hypothetically, if you want to do something, you're going to need something else to do it. For instance, if I want to paint a picture, for instance, it's imperative that I have some brushes. It's hard to say that I want to paint a picture if I don't have any brushes or if I don't have any paint. Now, is it imperative that I paint a picture? No, of course not. Not everybody paints pictures. Not everybody wants to paint a picture. So it's not always imperative that I have brushes or paints. If I have no interest in painting a picture, there's no necessity for me to have brushes or paints. So a hypothetical imperative always takes the form, if I want something, Y, I ought to do something else or have something else. Call it X. Right? If I want Y, I ought to do X. If I want to paint, I ought to get some brushes. And I ought to get some paints. Okay? So all of them take that form. If I want Y, I ought to do X. Now, Kant distinguishes between two subcategories of hypothetical imperatives. The first is he calls problematic hypothetical imperatives. And the problematic version is if I have a certain problem. Now, we hear that word, it's always negative, but a problem is simply something that I want to accomplish according to my whims. I have the whim, I have the desire to paint a picture. Now I automatically have a problem. How am I going to do that? I'm going to need a canvas, I'm going to need some brushes, I'm going to need some paints, maybe some other things. I have a problem. So if I want to paint a picture, I solve my problem by doing the things I need to do in order to get what I want. I need to get a canvas, I need to get brushes, I need to get paints. The other subcategory of hypothetical imperatives Kant refers to as prudential imperatives. Now, these are kinds of things that everybody as a human being might want. So for instance, if I get hungry, then I need to go to the store and get some food or something like that. It would be imprudent, it would not be very practically wise if I were hungry and I were to do nothing. If I'm hungry, I have to do something. I have to cook some food or go buy some food or bake some food or whatever I need to do. And things like needing food or needing rest or needing a home or wanting to take care of yourself or wanting to stay alive even are things all human beings want to do at least some of the time, most of their lives. And these are different from problematic hypothetical imperatives or problematic situations in that a problematic situation, according to Kant, is not something that everybody will want to do at least some of the time throughout their lives. Yeah, so not everybody wants to play basketball, not everybody wants to work on their car, not everybody wants to go to Europe. There are millions and millions and millions of things that people might want to do, and all of those have some imperatives or some necessities attached to them. Whereas prudential hypothetical imperatives are something, at least according to Kant, that everybody wants most of the time. For instance, just staying alive. All of us want to stay alive. We look both ways before we cross the street. Now, I suppose if somebody were terribly, terminally ill, they may no longer want to stay alive. So Kant keeps these kind of imperatives in the hypothetical category. If I want to stay alive, I better look both ways before I cross the street. If I want to stay alive, I better make sure I get food and water and rest. Now, I might not want to, but only under very extreme circumstances would I say that I no longer want to remain alive. Most of us, most of the time, want to remain alive. So for most of us, it's imperative or necessary that we get food and water and shelter and so forth. So that's the difference. Problematic, it depends on what I feel like doing or what I might want to do, and it may be different for every person, will be different for every person. And prudential, situations where it's just a matter of prudence, a matter of practical wisdom. As a human being, you're going to need certain things, you're going to need to do certain things. And all these imperatives come in the form of if I want Y, I ought to do X. So to walk down this a little bit further, under problematic hypothetical imperatives, well, there's a form of necessitation. Kant makes a distinction between necessity and necessitation that's discussed in the notes. But briefly, necessity and necessitation works like this. There are laws of physics, physical laws, laws of nature. Those laws operate by necessity. In other words, they will always operate, period. There's no getting around the law of gravity. And if you say, oh, well, we can fly in the air, we can launch rockets into outer space, thus, quote unquote, defying the laws of gravity, well, that's not really proper speaking. You don't defy the laws of gravity by flying an airplane. You understand how gravity works and how you work with it in order to take off, fly, and land safely an airplane. So laws of physics work by necessity. But laws that we're talking about now here and imperatives work by what Kant calls necessitation. He's making a technical distinction here. And they're not going to operate like laws of nature immediately. If you jump out a window, you will fall. Doesn't matter what you think, doesn't matter what you decide. But the imperatives we're talking about here don't work automatically, but they ought to work. So if you want to paint a picture, you ought to get some paints. You're not automatically going to get paints the minute the thought crosses your mind that you like to paint a picture. You might want to stay alive, but you're not automatically going to stay alive unless you do something. Go get some food and water, and you may fail to do something, either by your own decision or by fate or accident. So the rules, the laws we're talking about here are not going to work exactly like the laws of nature, which work by necessity. No, these laws work by what Kant calls necessitation. They ought to work. You should do them. It's not guaranteed automatically you're going to do them, but you should do them. So, for instance, in problematic imperatives, Kant says they're kind of like rules of skill or specific to players of a certain kind of game. And by game, he means something very broad. So painting a picture is as much of a game as playing basketball, and working on your car is as much of a game as playing basketball. It's their game wherein there are certain ways to proceed. If you're going to paint, there are certain quote-unquote rules that you have to follow. Now, they're pretty broad rules, and there's a lot of variation in them and so forth. That's why there's so many great painters with so many different styles and so on. But basically, you need certain skills in order to accomplish things like having a well-working car, or being able to score baskets in a basketball game, or being able to paint a picture. And he says he calls this a certain type of necessity is a technical imperative. When you learned in Aristotle about one of the intellectual virtues called techne, we learned that means a kind of knowledge that is know-how, knowing how to do something. And when you know how to do something, you know there are things involved, necessities involved in accomplishing any task, from doing your taxes to studying for a test to making a peanut butter and jelly sandwich and so on. So the kinds of things that are necessary or imperative in this problematic category are something like what's dictated by the rules of the skill of that activity and constitute technical imperatives or have a certain problematic necessity. And on the last line, horizontal line across the bottom, the conditions of possibility, all Kant really means by that is that these, you know what the necessities are, you know what the imperatives are by just analyzing or understanding at all the task that you're involved in. You can't say, I want to paint a picture without having paints and something to paint them on and something to put the paints on with. It's just by simply understanding what painting is that you know at least some of the things that are going to be necessary or imperative for that task. If you say, I want to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, just by understanding what it is that you just said you wanted, you will know that you're going to need bread and peanut butter and jelly and maybe something to spread them with and cut the bread with and so forth. So it's just by analysis. It's an analytic condition of possibility that you'll know what the imperatives or the necessities are. Now, if we walk down the prudential hypothetical imperatives, we say, well, you should look both ways before you cross the street. Get a good night's rest. Eat your vegetables. Take a vitamin. All work and no play is not good for you. Well, the kind of necessitation there Kant names the counsels of prudence. In other words, it's prudent if you want to live and be healthy and be happy that you follow certain dictates that constitute folk wisdom, a kind of knowing how to do well in life as a human being, no matter what your specific problems are. In other words, no matter what your specific choices are about your vocation and your hobbies and so forth in life, all of us as human beings ought to get a good night's sleep and eat our veggies and get some exercise and so on and so forth. So that's the form of necessitation there. It doesn't mean you're going to exercise. It doesn't mean you're going to get your vegetables or your vitamins, but you certainly should. You ought to. And how do we know that? Well, again, all the way at the bottom, the conditions of possibility. Well, it's also analytic. It's not maybe as clear when you say, I want to be happy. What's imperative for that? But we know kind of vaguely things that are imperative. If you want to be happy, according to Aristotle, well, you're going to need to be healthy. You're going to need to use your intellect. You're going to need to study. You're going to need to develop virtues. You're going to need to have friends. You're going to need to have an income. You're not going to need to even be a little good looking, he says. Well, maybe he's not right about the last thing. I hope for my sake he's not right about the last thing. But again, it's just by understanding what you're saying you want that you come to realize what you need. If you analyze what it means to have a good, happy, and healthy life, then you can begin to understand the imperatives, the necessities. And again, he calls that type of necessity a pragmatic imperative. If you're going to be pragmatic about things, you need to understand what it is you need to accomplish and be willing to do the things that you need to do in order to accomplish that. He also calls that an assertoric necessity. Again, it's in a sense in the assertion of what it is that you want to do. You don't need to be too concerned about these terms, but they show up in the text, and I want to try to talk you through them a little bit. So the technical imperatives of problematic hypothetical imperatives are based on an analysis of what activity you're engaged in. The pragmatic imperative, the assertoric necessity of the prudential hypothetical imperatives comes from just the assertion that you want to do certain things, and there's a lot of leeway about how you're going to do that. It's a little more vague than in any specific task like painting or working on a car, but still we have some understanding of what it is we want. We will automatically have some understanding of what kinds of things we need to do or are imperative to do. Now, all of those hypothetical imperatives and everything we said about that, the imperatives that take the form, if I want Y, I ought to do X, none of that, according to Kant, has anything to do with morality. None of it has anything to do with morality. And the reason it doesn't is because it's hypothetical. The hypothesis is you want to do something. But if you don't want to do that thing, if you don't want to paint, you don't need paints. If you don't want to stay alive, or you don't want to take care of yourself, then you don't have to do the things that would be imperative if you did want to do those things. Morality has nothing to do with the hypothetical. It has nothing to do with the hypothetical. So let's take a look at what kind of imperatives have to do with morality. And that's the categorical imperative. The categorical imperative. Something applying to any rational being, not just to even any human being, but if there were non-human rational beings, the imperatives to do certain things would apply to them just as much as they apply to us. Okay? It does not depend on your wanting anything or on your whims or anything like that. There's nothing hypothetical about it. There's no if in morality. The categorical imperative applies to you as a rational being, not as a human being. Does not take into account your human needs, as you'll learn in studying Kant and reading his texts and looking at the study guides and discussing this. What makes something right or wrong has nothing to do with how it might benefit you. It has nothing to do with whether you do or don't get what you want. And especially, it has nothing particular to do with your happiness or not. There may be things, according to Kant, that will make you happy that are not moral. And they're not moral because in getting what you want that made you supposedly happy, you violated a categorical imperative, something you must do just insofar as you're a rational being. So the formula of a categorical imperative is I ought to do X. No ifs. As a rational being, I ought to do X, whatever that is. Okay? And the form of necessitation, again, it's not necessity, because you and I know people do not behave morally even though we're all rational beings. All rational beings ought to do thus and so in order to be moral. We ought to do X, but we know that we don't. So moral necessity is not like the necessity of the laws of nature, like the laws of gravity that we're going to obey whether we like it or not. They are only of the power of necessitation, or things we ought to do. And he calls these the commands of morality, or the laws of morality. Obey or else. And there aren't many of those, as it turns out, but there are commands of morality. The type of necessity he calls the categorical imperative. It is apodictic necessity. All that means is it's absolutely necessary, no exceptions, no excuses. That it applies to all of us all the time as rational beings. That's the way morality works. Morality can't be a part-time thing for Kant. It can't be a thing unless there are exceptions or extenuating circumstances. Now, as humans, we may have difficult circumstances. We may have real problems that seem to prevent us from doing the right thing, but according to Kant, that doesn't make the right thing any less right, and it doesn't make the wrong thing that you might choose to do any less wrong. The categorical imperative applies with necessity. And the conditions of possibility, we'll need to leave this for another day, but you can read a little bit about this in the study guides. But he calls the conditions of possibility synthetic a priori. Just a quick note about that. An analytic condition of possibility, we said just a few moments ago, comes from just analyzing or just understanding the nature of what it is that you want, to paint a picture or to stay alive. In a way, it's the necessities or the imperatives are just built into the definition of what it is that you want to do. In fact, for instance, we all know it's true that all bachelors are unmarried males, because if we analyze the term bachelor, it means unmarried males. That's what it means. So it's just by the strict analysis. I don't need to go out in the world. I don't need to check with bachelors. I don't need to do a survey or a poll. any kind of a study? Not at all. All I need to do is analyze what bachelor means to know it's true that bachelors are unmarried males. A synthetic kind of a truth is something where the the uh, the proposition that you're interested in, the predicate is not contained in the subject. So when I say a bachelor is an unmarried male, the predicate is contained right there in the subject, bachelor. But when I say a person ought not to lie, well, not lying is not built into the definition of persons. It's something synthetic. It's something put together. Going back to bachelors, a synthetic proposition about bachelors would be something like all bachelors are tall. Tallness is not built into the definition of bachelors. You would need to go out into the world and check. If you find a non-tall, a short bachelor, then you know that my statement, all bachelors are tall, isn't true. Right? It puts together a synthesis of the subject and the predicate in such a way as you need to determine whether that synthesis holds, whether it's correct that all bachelors are tall. It's probably not correct. But a synthetic a priori condition of possibility is just something that says persons ought not to lie, but I still, even though not lying is not built into the definition of persons, I still don't need to go out in the world and check or do a survey or take a vote or do a study or any other kind. I should know that, as the words a priori mean, in advance of any kind of study, in advance of any kind of checking. So Kant thought they were these weird propositions that are synthetic. In other words, they're true. The truth of them is not a matter of just understanding the words like an analytic sentence, but they're a priori, which is kind of like analytic sentences. So kind of a square circle there, synthetic a priori, something that doesn't, like an oxymoron in a way. Synthetic statements ought to be a posteriori. All bachelors are tall. You won't know that until a posterior. You won't know that until after you go and check, not before. But Kant thinks there are certain kinds of propositions like this, and categorical imperatives are one of them. Persons ought never to lie. That's synthetic, but also a priori. It doesn't matter how the world is. It's true without exception. Absolutely. So Kant has some difficult terminology and some difficult ideas, but I just at this point really want you to hear the difference between the categorical and the hypothetical. A lot of times we may think that moral rules are hypothetical. If you're in certain situations, the following actions are okay, but if the circumstances were different, maybe the same exact action is not okay. A lot of times we think like that, but Kant does not think like that. If an act is wrong, it's wrong for everybody and forever, no matter what the circumstances are. And he thinks for a moral law to be a moral law, a moral command, it has to apply universally, timelessly, eternally. And that's something that we need to discuss. So I hope that helps. If you have any questions, you can always email me.